My name is Paul Tumusime, and I work with Araken and NPA. I'm the country program manager. And I want to welcome you from your break. And even for those that have been with us since yesterday, thank you so much for being here. I'm the one taking you through this session, and this session is very exciting. We have a number of speakers. So, but before I go in there, I also want to first and foremost thank the sponsors, the partners, of course, Sino, Total, Talo, GMAC, and all the people that have really made this happen in Uganda. But for this session, our first speaker is going to, there are two gentlemen. They are from an organization called Cordaid, and one of them is Jeroen. And Jeroen is a program manager for Extractives for the Catholic organization for relief, that is Cordaid. And he has done extensive work in this area. Together with his colleague, Martin Kwori, they've also done a lot of work in this area. And they're the ones that are going to submit on social impact of oil and gas activities, that is community perception from Southern Sudan and Kenya. Ladies and gentlemen, please let's put our hands to welcome Jeroen and Martin.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. My name is indeed Jeroen. I'm based in Nairobi, and actually I just realized that I'm the only, I hope I'm not the only representative from Kenya here, because that feels a little bit odd indeed to have this Dutch Mzungu talking about what's happening in Kenya. But in any case, I'll try to give you a fair idea on what we are doing. And I'll be doing this presentation jointly with my colleague Martin, who's based in Juba. Very briefly, before we go into the detail of some of the findings, about Cordaid and what we do. Cordaid is indeed a Dutch development organization based in the Netherlands, and we have many different programs. But one of the programs that many people do not know about that we're also working on is on oil, gas and mining issues, and particularly the social aspects of it. In this slide you can very briefly see, and I think the top part of the slide is very, very familiar for those of you who are working in the oil, gas and mining industry, the Extractives value chain with its different phases of exploration, development, production and closure. A timeline which can take anything from 15, 20 to even 100 years, 150 years, depending on what kind of industry and site it is. What we do as Cordaid, we have developed a number of approaches and what we call products to help communities to be frank, to get a better deal out of the oil, gas and mining projects in their area. So we normally start with doing a community perception assessment and trying to understand from a community perspective what some of the risks are, and we try to analyze that together with a number of civil society organizations active in that area. Then we try to develop as much as possible a common agenda, bringing together the different stakeholders, not only with civil society but also very much with local, national government and the international oil, gas and mining companies. During the production phase, we try to come up with mechanisms where the community can also participate in the management of the natural resources, including sometimes in the distribution of the benefits as well. The acronyms you see there, CDF stands for Community Development Foundations, which are particularly, let's say, some of our colleagues in Nigeria have experimented with that. And despite the fact that Nigeria gets a lot of bad news, and unfortunately sometimes also for the right reasons, but there's also a lot of interesting things happening, very innovative ways happening in Nigeria, including, let's say, on how communities can also benefit a bit more from oil production. So I think it's worthwhile to also look at that. CAC stands for Citizen Advisory Councils, which are basically an extra oversight mechanism from citizens in addition to the normal regulatory agencies. And finally, we also try to influence policies and standards in order to improve them internationally. So what we're trying to achieve is to have informed participation. I think it's very important for us, at least, that if civil society and particularly communities want to engage with a highly, I would say, knowledge-intensive, capital-intensive industry, which is the oil and gas and mining sector, they have to be properly informed. It's very difficult indeed for them otherwise to engage in that. And we certainly see it as our role to help in that. We try to come to a negotiated agreement rather than just purely hard-nosed advocacy, even though we very much also believe that that can have its role in place. But our approach is very much about constructive dialogue, trying to bring people together to come up with joint solutions. And finally, whenever there are agreements, we would like to make sure that there is participatory monitoring. That also includes civil society organizations and even community members from the affected areas, as well as renegotiation, so that after a period of time, people can really assess, okay, is this working also for us? And if not, how can we make sure that it is? Now you might want to ask, why engage with civil society at all in oil, gas and mining industry? What has civil society to do with it? I would say that ignoring civil society comes at a huge price. And it's not only the price in terms that either government or companies pay in terms of not having them in the room, but it's particularly the price, let's say, that civil society sometimes tends to very much react emotionally to not having the right type of information that they would like to have to inform their constituents and particularly the communities in the areas. So and unfortunately there is an increasing recognition that civil society organizations can play an important role, can actually help to increase transparency, accountability, and even also reduce tensions. It's true also that there are, within civil society organization, civil society in general brings together a large group of different types of organizations with very different approaches, different interests, etc. And I think that's the reality we'll just have to deal with. But I think it's also important to mention that there are also groups within civil society who are very open to engaging. So I think that as much as civil society sometimes has difficulty in engaging with companies or with governments, I think it's also good if companies and governments can also open up a little and try to identify those organizations that are willing to engage constructively. Civil society organizations can provide input into law drafting, policies, and regulations, and particularly in helping communities to understand about what is coming to their backyards. However, there are a number of very important preconditions for civil society organizations to play a constructive role. First of all, I would say really like a minimum requirement is sufficient political space. And what I mean by that is that having the opportunity to ask questions without feeling that they have to look at if they are being threatened, as it were. Can they really engage openly, both with government and with companies, without a fear of retribution? Also, the transparency and willingness to engage, both by government and businesses. And I'm very happy to see here, at least in Uganda, that there is clearly also in this workshop demonstrated transparency and willingness to also engage. But for civil society to do its work also, that might need to be raised even to a higher level. Also, transparency and accountabilities of civil society organizations themselves. We as an international partner always stress and emphasize to our partners that you cannot just blame the government and the companies for its either for poor performance or for not meeting the requirements. We also, as civil society organizations, have to practice what we preach and be transparent and accountable. And finally, also, it's important that civil society organizations' technical knowledge is being improved, particularly about oil, gas, and mining issues, both the technical aspects of it, but also the social aspects and the potential impacts, so that they can also deal more constructively with governments and with companies. So overall, I would like to say that civil society organizations are sometimes, in the old days, they even sometimes used to be seen as watchdogs, but I think they can also, I mean, as I like to reiterate this phrase from one of the government ministers in South Sudan, they actually said it can also be a real guide dog for governments and even for companies sometimes, particularly at the community level, which could benefit other stakeholders. So going into the content of our presentation, what Martin and I will be sharing with you are some, at least for South Sudan, final findings, and but for Kenya, some preliminary findings of what we call social baseline assessments, or what actually I think is a better term is community perception assessments. And what we mean by that is that yesterday we heard several references in presentations about the plan, do, check, act cycle. And I know that it's a very common management system which is being used not only in companies and governments, including also in larger international civil society organizations. However, I think one of the big omissions in that cycle, or at least is assumed too much, is that we need to first, before we actually go to the planning stage actually, we need to really sit down, listen, and understand about what's happening in these areas that we're going to move to. And I think it might sound like stating the obvious, but I think it's extremely important that we listen to communities in the areas where we're all operating in. And I think that everybody would say that's important, but there's only very few of us who actually do that. And that's very much what we're trying to do together with some of our civil society partners. And so to generate community-specific information and very much listen to what do they expect, what are some of their concerns, what are they afraid of that will happen in that areas around existing and also potential future impacts. Also, based on that finding, then to come up with recommendations for designing and implementing more conflict-sensitive stakeholder engagement processes. And also to really set up like a dialogue process, which then also allows for much more participation in impact identification. So not just a team of consultants moving in, doing a study and reporting back to the companies. No, really to try and sit down together with the community and also help them identify what some of their fears are and how they can be addressed, how they can be mitigated. And finally, we also really spend a lot of time on identifying and analyzing what the different stakeholders are. So not just a quick list of everybody's interest, but really to very much understand why are they here, how do they operate, what is their approach, how can people, let's say, question if they have certain concerns, etc. So in other words, how can they become much more participatory? What we normally do with these type of exercises is that it's very much like a collaborative effort. So it's not only myself or Martin or any other Cordaid colleague going out. It's very much a collaborative effort. We do that together with a number of civil society organizations who are active in that particular area, and then spend quite a bit of time in those areas to do these studies. I think I'd like to invite Martin to share his views on what we did in South Sudan.
Thank you very much, my colleague Jeroen. All the protocols remain observed. As you have heard from several presentations, including from our Honorable Minister, who actually acknowledged the issues affecting the oil sector in South Sudan. I would like to take this opportunity to congratulate her on her frankness to acknowledge those issues, and together we applaud her as one of the women leaders. This has demonstrated to us that women leaders are mothers, and mothers always tell the truth, and this is what they inculcate in their children. And together, if we could have this movement and encourage a growth in women leadership, I think Africa would have a bigger impact.
Ladies and gentlemen, my presentation focuses on community perceptions on what the impact of oil and gas activities is to their socio-economic well-being. As you have heard from the earlier presenter, my colleague Jeroen de Zeeuw, I normally hate speaking with a mic, and I hope my voice will be audible enough to those ones at the back. Can you hear me? Yeah? Can you hear me at the back? Yes. Okay. Yes, I have some kind of a teaching background for several years, so I am audible enough to be heard by someone at the back. So as you have heard from my colleague, this was a collaborative social baseline assessment with several of our partners, and we carried out this study in 2 of the states of South Sudan, Upper Nile and Unity states, in order to better understand community concerns related to oil business. Of course, we had several thematic areas of the study, including community perceptions related to benefits of the industry, impact on environment, health and livelihood, community engagement and community consultation structures. However, this particular presentation will focus on the social aspects, how the industry impacts community lives. As you have heard, as most of you might have heard and might have also known about the oil industry of South Sudan, it is currently regarded as the lifeblood of the economy, contributing about 98% of the fiscal budget and about 80% of the GDP. So you can imagine what it means to the country. That is one of the social impacts in terms of benefits I can say to the whole country. It's helping to sustain, of course, our current government, including our population. And it is one thing to be excited about, of having a new government in a country which has never had a government for several years. And we know that there are challenges, but nevertheless we are also happy because at least we have a government to be proud of. In relation to benefits, some people got access to jobs. The study indicated that some people have access to jobs. Well, there's also some efforts being made in the area of infrastructural development like schools, health centers, and etc. by the oil operating companies. Okay. And you will also realize that companies also supply water to communities with trucks. If you go down to the oil fields of South Sudan, and you will also notice that some community members benefited from scholarships. These are some of the benefits of the industry that is being offered to the local communities in South Sudan. And for the case of Melut, at least 3 air tickets are being provided by the oil company, Depot, that is operating there, whenever they fly to Juba. Small businesses have also sprung up in Palach, the central oil collection point or processing point, as some of you call it. Nevertheless, communities are dissatisfied with the quality of the services provided. We acknowledge that, well, the oil industry has substantial benefits to the nation, but communities, when interviewed, are dissatisfied with the quality of the services provided. And why so? It's simply because communities believe that the negative risks outweigh the social benefits. As you can see from the pictures there, that is what is happening actually on the ground. You will see there that companies use some of the chemical containers previously to supply communities with drinking water, so that communities could come and draw water from there. Because what happens is, during construction of roads leading to the oil facilities, there were some water catchments that got blocked. And because oil exploration coincided with the 1983 Liberation Civil War, communities by the successive regimes in the north did not regard the people of the south as human beings to be taken care of. So in that regard, the companies at the time operated and did not take care of the environment. If you go down on the ground, you'll find some water catchments where the roads pass. There are no proper drainage systems, and so when you block it, you force the other water catchment areas to dry off. So therefore, the only way communities could rely upon is the Nile. And the Nile is some distance away from some of the local communities. So what the oil companies do is to supply them with drinking water like that. But unfortunately, in the past, that was done with, and the water was just provided in those chemical containers. So you who are scientists, you can guess what could be taking place. One of the reasons as to why communities are still dissatisfied with all the other benefits I've talked about is oil business has led to previously unknown imbalances within communities. Whereas some jobs have been availed to the local communities, you will also acknowledge that very few people got jobs. And of course, there's this issue, as our honorable deputy ministers acknowledged, this issue of balancing between public interest and individual interest vis-a-vis party interest. And so, how would you say to a colleague whom you have been in close engagements when he requests you, for example, to avail a job to somebody you have close acquaintances with? This is the issue that we need to wrestle out. The flow and mixture of people in the social environment also already characterized by vulnerability and feelings of marginalization also contributes to tensions between local people. It creates rumors and a feeling of social jealousy. The oil business has also created multiple conflicts around land, because there were indigenous peoples there, and when oil exploration took place, these people were expelled forcibly during the war, and when they came back, realizing that they have now their own government where they feel it should be able to cater for their needs, they came back to their original areas. And yet, these are either close to or within the oil producing facilities. But the question is, with the engagement in oil production activities, how viable are those areas to sustain people's livelihood? There are also widespread rumors of government staff misusing funds in the past. And these seem to be very closely linked to issues to do with corruption. The issue here is, in the past there was no structured community consultation process. Of course, we have the traditional leadership that comprises chiefs, local chiefs, but again, these local structures have been alienated to political ruling regimes. And when you alienate these political structures, political ruling regimes, in quasi-democracies, unlike in strong democracies, you will realize that, of course, there are issues to do there with the political games. You either support who is giving you bread so that you keep sustaining the bread, or you don't. The industry is also perceived by the local communities to have caused an attitude of waiting and expecting, most especially among men and especially the young men. People just sit, they play cards, and they expect that, okay, they are endowed with this substantial resource and that it would help address all their issues. So the area of local content is a gray area that government should be able to build local capacity. A problem also with some sort of dilemmas of has been created as to who should actually provide services to the communities, government or companies. When the communities asked, some of them saying that it's supposed to be the sole responsibility of the oil companies to provide them with services. And government says, hey, the oil companies are here, you see, extracting. The local government will say the companies are here extracting your resource. They're supposed to help you in the area of corporate social responsibility. But then where do we put the communities? They seem to be in dilemma, and this is something that other countries which are still venturing into oil production like Uganda should learn from. One of the issues also communities feel the oil industry has not done enough is lack of access to accurate information about the oil business. And this creates superstitions and rumors. While we acknowledge that, well, this study is on community perceptions, and perceptions, as you know, scientifically are subjective opinions, but they seem to tell underlying issues that should not be underestimated. So in order for companies to buy social licenses to operate, and for governments to be legitimate, because if you want to foster true democracy, and that means that your legitimacy comes from the people, you ought to have to listen to the people in order to be recognized as a legitimate government or a company that has been given a social license to operate. One of the issues is, over the past years, the oil industry has been shrouded in secrecy, and it has been treated as an issue of national security. And so the people's opinions and feelings have been suppressed for so long that they could not express themselves publicly of the concerns affecting them or their well-being. And so some of them in the expressions even said they perceive companies more of their enemies than friends. There was and still is this issue of unstructured community consultation that I've talked about. So recommendations that we came up with together with the local communities, that it is pertinent for oil companies and governments or stakeholders in this industry to come together and be able to start meaningful and constructive dialogue. As most of you know about the historical backgrounds of civil society, most of them are perceived by different sectors as antagonistic and radicals. So it's high time that we left being radicals. There is a need to evaluate and remedy damages, redesign and enforce management plans for health, safety, and environment. The Honorable Deputy Minister has already talked about the need for an environmental audit, and that is already in pipeline. We hope it will materialize. There is need to design and implement appropriate compensation measures for losses and suffering during the war and after the CPA period. Compensation was ad hoc in nature, not clear for who, for what, and at what level. This should be corrected. There is need to improve basic services and support community-based development initiatives in the oil-affected counties. Maybe companies could come together and set up community social funds, where communities could draw this fund from for the community-based projects. I'm very glad that we have started initiating a sort of multi-stakeholder dialogue, what we call a monthly planning and review meeting together with the joint oil operating companies and the government. We have had so far 2 sessions and it's fruitful. We believe these interventions can be sustained. And therefore, we need to create space for creative thinking on more inclusion and responsible oil mining projects. And this brings into consideration the issue of local content. Yesterday, there have been a lot of issues surrounding the issue of recognition of local certificates. The question is, why can't these institutions instead seek certification from these international bodies rather than the students? And if there are international standards, which I also believe other countries or nations are part, why should other countries' papers not become recognized as the international standards? This is something that needs to be picked up at international level for debate. I believe some of these professors or trainers are trained at international level. But how come that when they are at the local level, what they offer becomes not need to be rather satisfied. This is something that people should take up at the international level for discussion, and thank you very much for listening.
Since we only have a few minutes left for the remaining part, let me just go through this very quickly. I'll also share with you some of the preliminary findings, as we've just completed it in September in Turkana, which is the main oil exploration region now in Kenya. As you can see here, these are some of the oil blocks currently in Kenya, and Turkana, it basically covers this part. And the main operators in this area are Tullow Oil and Cepsa, a Spanish oil company. What most people don't know is that oil exploration in Kenya has been there since the early 80s, but there's been very little information on that. But the commercially viable quantities of oil have only been established about 2 years ago. So that's where, at least this is the region with the most intensive oil exploration at the moment. And that's also where we have done our assessment. So very briefly, what communities are saying to us, at least during that assessment, was that there are clearly benefits, and they also appreciated the fact that Turkana, which is generally a very marginalized and underdeveloped region in Kenya, has also benefited from the oil exploration and also the wider presence of companies in that area. The main benefits that are highlighted include employment. There's actually quite a large number of people being employed, even though as casual laborers, but it provides a very much welcomed source of income. There has been quite a large scholarship program to give people opportunities to study both at secondary level as well as tertiary university level. That has also benefited not only Turkana but also other parts of Kenya. And slowly but surely there's also some infrastructure coming up. So there has been some improvement to the roads, even though they are still of very, very poor quality. But there are some improvements. However, as Martin said, I think also in Turkana the concerns and the negative perceptions actually outweigh the positive ones. And here you can see some of these the concerns that were raised. I won't go into detail into all of them. I just want to share with you some of their top 3 concerns, which include insecurity, displacement and land access, and lack of awareness and understanding. So one of the biggest concerns that communities have around oil exploration in Turkana is a growing perception of insecurity. Now, you might wonder why that is. It has a lot to do with the fact that Turkana being an area where there has been a lot of conflict, social conflict between different communities, as well as conflict related to cattle raiding, particularly between Turkana and the Pokot, but also between Turkana and neighboring tribes, for instance in South Sudan with the Tokosa and other groups. Traditionally, there was a community protection force called the Kenya Police Reservists, the KPR, which had the mandate, and we were even recognized by the government, were given weapons. Unfortunately, no training, but they were there as a source to protect the community. When the oil companies started their their exploration activities, many of these so-called traditional community protection forces, they were taken up as protection units by the oil companies. And this has left some of the communities in those areas exposed. And there have been a number of, dozens of different types of attacks, which at least according to the community are attributed to the fact that they're no longer protected. To be fair, particularly Tullow Oil, which is the main operator in this area, is very much aware of that problem, and they are also looking for a solution. But the problem in this particular case is that also security issues is also it's a national government responsibility. So it's not so much only a responsibility of the company to come up with that. They have been trying to come up with different ways, but the government has not yet responded in the manner that communities at least need. The other growing concern is land access. Turkana is an area where Predominantly, people have a pastoralist form of livelihood, so there's many people who are moving around in the area. And even though the company claims that there's only, out of a total land mass of 77,000 square kilometers, there's only 16 square kilometers taken for land. According to the community, they perceive it very differently, because they feel that there are certain areas, let's say, which have so many different access roads that communities do not feel that they can pass through those type of areas very easily with their cattle. So they feel that they have to make really big detours to move around, as it were, and to search for greener pastures, literally. And so that is certainly an issue which is becoming problematic. The other thing which is happening is that there is some displacement, partly due to insecurity and partly also from other areas. There is also a lot of speculative investment taking place in Turkana, particularly around smaller oil boom towns like Lokichar, which is really the mainstay at the moment of the oil industry there. And so people are basically being chased away from their land, and other land, which is communal land, by the way, and other land not being available means that people are basically displaced. So that's also a growing problem. And finally, one of the other top concerns, as it were, highlighted by the community, is the lack of awareness and understanding. And that has a lot to do with the fact that the way the information is being shared. And again, the company has, and also I think to its credit, has tried to develop communication material, and has actually opened up communication offices in different areas, but those offices are still very, very far from the areas where the communities who are directly impacted by the oil production sites are. So, and it's also, it's not always in a format, as it were, that communities, certainly people who cannot read and write, can understand. So what are we trying to do, or at least what we are trying to highlight, together with some other members of it? There's a local civil society coalition, which is called the Turkana Natural Resource Governance Hub. It's a very loose and very new type of coalition, and we're trying to support them. But it's to build capacities, particularly around the areas of transparency, so to make sure that there's not only information being shared, but there's also real knowledge being built up. And also that communication is not only one way in terms of from the community or from the government towards the company, towards the community, but also that communities can actually raise their questions and get their answers also. And I think that really has to be improved much further. Also, accountability, I think, is very, very important, and at the moment it's not really properly working well. What makes it particularly complex in the Kenyan context is that there's because of the new constitution and the devolution process taking place, even the county government is still relatively new, needs a lot of support in terms of capacity building, and there's a bit of a gray zone, a vacuum, if you like, taking place, where it's not entirely clear who's responsible for what. Again, that needs to be much further improved, and there's need for much more dialogue. At the moment, there is no, as I've heard several references here in Uganda, at least, of being a dialogue. In Turkana, at least, it's very, very limited still. There is a lot of interaction between the company at the national level with the national government, but not with the company at the county level government. Again, there are certain measures being put in place to improve that, but that's still very, very early. And also, to be frank again, civil society also needs to step up in terms of its accountability role. There's very few civil society organizations who actually go out to these remote places and talk to communities on a regular basis. So also accountability needs to be improved in that sector as well. And finally, it's also a question of, I think there's a need for much more responsibility that needs to be taken for government and politicians in particular to ensure genuine citizen participation and to deliver on promises. There's many of the false expectations and very high expectations that we currently have in Turkana are because of the poor way in which information is being communicated, and the sometimes also unrealistic promises that are being made. That's giving a real challenge. For investors, they obviously need to comply with international standards and best practices. Civil society, I think, needs to take responsibility to listen much more carefully on what communities really want and need, and to come together much more, because it's still very much also a divided civil society in that area. And finally, I think that international partners, particularly development partners, have to provide more tailor-made support. There's very few assistance packages available for that area, particularly around oil, gas and mining information awareness raising. So finally, to close, I think what we are trying to do in order to move forward, and I'm not entirely sure if this slide is visible for the people in the back, but we have a tool that we are working on. We call it a community guidebook, which is it's actually a set of different materials. It's not only a book with text, but it will also be, there will be 3 different formats actually. There will also be a version which is purely pictorial, so also for people who cannot read and write. We're trying to develop specialized material, even though also in partnership with some of the people who used to work in the oil, gas and mining industry, who have the technical expertise also, but then to try and translate that into very specific community messages, as it were, that will help to provide the right type of information in order to manage these type of expectations. And that's something we're going to continue, not only in South Sudan and in Kenya, but also in other countries where we're active. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much.